Welcome, everyone. Today's webinar is on physician leadership and physician leadership transitions. I'm Kevin Kirkpatrick. We're going to dive into a critical challenge facing healthcare organizations. How do we successfully transition our best clinicians into effective leaders? Healthcare is changing faster than ever before. The pandemic accelerated digital transformation. We're seeing shifts from volume-based to value-based. Workforce challenges are at an all-time high. We're dealing with everything from AI integration to social determinants of health. All of this requires strong clinical leadership to navigate successfully. So here's what's interesting. Studies consistently show that top-performing hospitals in the US are led by physicians, especially in specialized programs, cancer, GI, cardiac cares. The quality scores and performance metrics are significantly higher when physicians are leading. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Kristen Woods, a physician leadership coach who specializes in working with clinicians to help them make a transition into leadership roles and to be successful. Dr. Woods, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Kevin. As you know, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And as you said, we're seeing this need for transformation, and physicians increasingly want to be a part of leading transformation, and they're taking on leadership roles, but very few of them receive formal leadership development outside of their clinical training. And so a lot of physicians are going out to get masters in business or healthcare administration, but we all know that didactic learning isn't the same as real world experience. It's like why physicians do internships and residencies after medical school. It's to get that hands-on experiential learning.
So I think it's also important for us to clarify in the context of today's discussion that we're not talking just about physicians in, defined leadership roles. We're talking about physicians in general.
That's exactly right. All physicians are seen as leaders. They influence their care teams, committees, and operations. But leadership skills, while essential for every physician, today we're really focusing on those physicians that are transitioning into official leadership positions like department heads, chief medical officers, medical directors, chief of staff, these type of roles where the stakes and the complexities are even higher.
So let's dig into the specific challenges that a lot of these physicians would face. And Dr. Woods, what would you say is the biggest obstacle?
Well, role ambiguity is huge, Kevin. According to the American Association for Physician Leadership, unclear expectations contribute to 47% of leadership failures in healthcare settings. And I see this frequently where really talented, smart physicians are promoted based on their clinical excellence, but they struggle in a leadership role because nobody clearly defined what success looks like in this new role. So role ambiguity is one of the top issues I see.
And it's interesting because as a recruiter, that's often one of the things that we have to work the hardest with our clients on is defining the requirement so that we can actively engage with physicians that might be interested. Can you give us an example of what this would look like?
Yeah, absolutely. One example I have is a cardiologist that was a phenomenal physician, and he was promoted into a role as medical director. And he took on this role with the ambition of really advocating for cardiology and the important role it played within the system. And he wanted to advance their capabilities and their contributions. So 6 months in, though, he was really frustrated because he was still practicing with the peers that he now had to lead. And while he thought his job was advocating for their specialty and maximizing their intent, because he came at it with that thought process, he was negotiating with the system leaders as if the department were an independent practice from the organization itself. So meanwhile, the system leaders expected him to support system change initiatives and develop new workflows and drive peer engagement. So they weren't aligned, and it quickly escalated into an us versus them type scenario.
Well, it's interesting because on my Physicians Who Lead podcast, a lot of the conversations have been with leaders have been about the transition from, peer to leader and stuff like that. So from a recruitment perspective, this creates a problem because often the expectations for a search are then deemed as unsuccessful because we've got conflict that's been arisen, and it could turn into turnover and attrition. What types of supports from an organization should we put into place for these?
Well, first of all, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you talked about starting with the recruitment process is being very clear on what the expectations are for this role and what the success looks like for this role. So when the organization comes at it with that clarity, then they can also create a strong onboarding process. The research shows that only 32% of healthcare organizations offer a structured onboarding for their physicians. If we think about corporate America, it's the norm to have a structured onboarding when someone comes into a new role. But I think we often, when physicians especially are promoted from within an organization into a leadership role, we assume that they already understand the nuances and complexities of the organization, when in fact they often don't. So going back to having clarity of the role and then an onboarding process to support that physician is critical.
It's interesting because I remember talking to a physician who said, I got my email password, I got my corporate domain password to get the devices, and I got my cell phone, and that was the extent of my onboarding, right? So, understanding that this is a gap, and sometimes gaps need to be addressed by a cost and stuff like that. What is the cost of the lack of support?
Well, I think it's substantial. Without proper onboarding, we know it almost doubles the time for a physician leader to reach full productivity in their new role. And aside from reaching full productivity slower, turnover rates hit almost 26% within the first 2 years of a physician leader going into their role. So from a recruitment standpoint, I'm sure you can appreciate this. There's a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of personal energy that goes into recruiting a physician leader, both on the organization side, but also for the person being recruited. So when you think about it, 26% turnover rate in those first 2 years, the cost is pretty substantial.
Yeah, and if you consider the inefficiencies that are driven when there's no leadership or there's a leadership transition, the recruitment fees and all of these aspects, there is a substantial cost. And then there's the fundamental shift from a clinical practice to leadership thinking, right? And I think something that I remember talking to a physician about was pace, right? They're used to being at the bedside, making a diagnosis and a treatment plan that was dealt with in the moment, and then moving to a leadership role where all of a sudden the timeline is considerably longer.
That's probably the most challenging aspect of the entire shift. The first two things we talked about, role clarity and onboarding, lie heavily on the hiring team's place. But the mindset shift that's required of physicians to move from a clinical aspect as an independent contributor to a leader where you have to wear that hat as an organizational leader, as a systems thinker. It's a big mindset shift that people have to make. And I often tell physician leaders that what got you here isn't going to keep you here unless you keep developing those leadership skills. Again, if we look at studies and research, 76% of physicians cite that mindset shift from individual patient focus to systems thinking as the biggest hurdle that they have to overcome.
Yeah, and I've seen this with recruitment as well. More when I was an internal recruiter, is that the turnover at the medical director role for one hospital, like people would almost do their year because they were somewhat voluntold or they were the last person to that meeting, and then at the end of the year that they haven't been supported or it wasn't what they thought, it was up to the next person, right? So the ability to assume that a great clinician is going to be a great leader. A lot of times great clinicians don't necessarily even want to be leaders. They're assuming that clinical excellence will translate into leadership effectiveness, but that's not always the case.
No, you hit the nail on the head. It's not just about the acquiring skills like financial acumen or such, but it's really an identity shift. They're moving from being the person with all the answers that people look to make that important decision in the moment, to being a person that can ask the right questions, to being someone who invests in and develops other people. And that fundamental change has to shift internally on how they see themselves. And I just recently worked with a leader that was, like you said, promoted into a medical director role. And he only made it about a year and then he left out of frustration. But thankfully, the chief medical officer did an exit interview with him to understand what the experience was. And through that exit interview, the chief medical officer understood that they really failed to provide the right support to this new physician leader. And the physician leader thought, I just don't have the skill set to be a leader, and was going to hang up that path entirely until the chief medical officer intervened and said, well, why don't we explore some coaching? We'll get you the leadership skills and training that you need. And was able to turn this person's career trajectory around, or help that person turn the career trajectory around by supporting them with the right skills, and also to help shift that mindset.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what I've done is I've partnered with some organizations when we've hired a medical leader, and we've partnered by aligning them with options for coaching and stuff like that. And it's sometimes and even an external process where somebody is assuming a new role and giving them the coaching to move through the new environment, or in some cases it's an internal candidate that turns out to be the best option in the market, but you want them to be successful, right? So talk to me about how leadership coaching specifically addresses the challenges with things like role clarity.
Right. That's a great question. So coaching provides a very structured approach to start by defining roles and expectations from multiple perspectives of key stakeholders. So when I work with a physician leader, we start by understanding what that physician leader thinks their role is, but then I interview their direct supervisor, potentially board members or department staff, maybe an administrative dyad that they might be working with. And we get all those perspectives on what they think this role should be delivering. From there, we can create role mapping to define boundaries, to define authority limits, and to really clarify what the success metrics are going to be for that role.
Excellent. And I think we see this with executives and stuff like that, that we don't see it at the same level as physicians. But can you share some data on how effective it is?
Yes, absolutely. There was an academic medical center study that found coached physician leaders reached their performance goals 40% faster than non-coached peers, and that role clarity interventions reduced leadership stress by about 50% within the first 3 months,
Wow.
And almost 90% of coach physician leaders reported greater confidence in understanding the organizational expectations.
That's those are some compelling numbers, but that show a direct value that's not necessarily a sort of like a fluffy thing. These are statistics around financial performance that's included in these aspects. How does coaching enhance the onboarding process?
Well, obviously, HR still plays a really important role. The HR teams would handle compliance and administrative aspects. What coaching does is complement those administrative pieces by giving that person a personalized development plan that addresses their strengths, where there might be some gaps and opportunities to stretch and grow. And then the coaching creates a safe place for vulnerability, and for asking questions outside of formal reporting structures. And sometimes we even do role playing of scenarios so people can practice a new skill set before going out into a real meeting and trying out a skill for the first time.
Well, it's interesting because in the 20 years that I've been working with physicians, I often get people that reach out to me about a leadership development course they want me to push in front of physicians, right? And like come sit somewhere for a week and learn how to be a leader. And it's interesting because that's really just a strategy session, right? Like it's a session where here are the methodologies that we've used in the past. Learn these methodologies. Whereas I think what you're talking about from a coaching standpoint really is about the individual and helping the individual perform their best, as opposed to saying, hey, you know what, you're gonna learn a new financial accounting method, right? So can you give us an example of what it looks like in practice?
Yes. I think I love how you describe that as there's the didactic learning about a new skill, reading about a new skill, versus actually being hands-on with it. And so I think both are important. It's good to get theory, but then you have to practice. And so a good example would be a physician leader that was promoted into a chief medical officer role. And so now she found herself as part of budget meetings, capital request meetings, and other finance meetings that weren't her power suit. It wasn't her strength. And she had a lot of insecurity around her contributions in those meetings. So we were able to discuss what her concerns were about making when it came to making financial decisions or contributing to them. We did some different role-playing scenarios around real examples that she was dealing with in her organization. And then together we developed strategies that allowed her to ask clarifying questions without appearing uninformed or ignorant in that space, which was her biggest fear. So she couldn't really have had those conversations with the CFO or her direct supervisor, but we could work those out in the background and in a very safe, psychologically safe place.
Yeah, I think the safety is a big thing, especially within a corporate environment where you're constantly being evaluated. Having that safe space where you can have those vulnerable conversations and work on developing yourself, and getting that feedback in preparation as opposed to after the fact, I think is great. What were the results like with that individual?
With this individual, she started to lead with a lot more confidence and was better integrated into the team. She felt there was a greater acceptance, and her thoughts and suggestions weren't dismissed as quickly as they had been. So she found that she felt much more integrated into the team. But I can also share some data in general that show leaders in fact, do integrate faster into leadership teams when they have coaching by 63%, and that leaders with coaching show 47% reduction in decision-making uncertainty, and almost 60% have an improvement in their strategic priority setting. You know, I think about the comment that leadership is lonely. I don't know if you've heard that. I've heard it a lot. But this is exactly why it can be lonely and isolating. So having a coach helps take some of that loneliness away. And then the other thing that this ties to is when their professional stress starts to drop, they're not bringing that stress home. And so their work-life integration is much better and balanced, and they can relax better. It becomes this feed-forward cycle because they're not so amped up and stressed from the work issues.
So let's circle back a little bit and talk about that clinical leadership transition specifically. What competencies do you focus on when someone's making that transition?
There are 5 key areas that we focus on, and we can move through this fluidly depending on what the situation dictates for that individual. But those 5 key areas are emotional intelligence development, and that's always present. We all can develop stronger emotional intelligence, and it's critical, especially in today's day and age. Then strategic thinking and systems perspective is a second area. Conflict management and having those difficult conversations, especially when it comes to corrective feedback. Change management skills is the 4th area, that agile thinking, but also how to create engagement with the teams that you're leading or influencing. And then that last area is that financial literacy, especially in the context of organizational finance or health system finance.
Can we talk a bit about the mindset shift and how you manage that as you manage from a clinician to a leader?
Yeah, as we said earlier, this is one of the most important skills and transitions that a physician has to make when they move into a leadership role. As clinicians, success is defined by individual patient outcomes. Did this patient get better? Are they progressing toward their, the patient's goals and priorities that they've set? But as leaders, success is measured by system outcomes. Are we improving care for entire populations? Are we creating sustainable processes for the organization or the system as a whole? And are we developing other leaders so that there's a succession plan and a smooth functioning or highly efficient team? So the success measures broaden, and the mindset has to shift on that perspective to be more strategic and all-encompassing. It really does require some cognitive reframing of what success looks like. And then you pointed out so well earlier that success also is slower. When you're in the clinical space, you often have pretty immediate responses, maybe except in primary care where there's a lot of chronic disease, but nonetheless, there's this immediate feedback loop where in leadership roles, change is slower and success often comes from a slower process. So that's a shift too that physicians have to navigate.
Well, and one of the things that's really interesting is, you mentioned succession planning, right? And I mean, I've been working with physicians for a long time, and I enjoy that. But historically, they are not good at succession planning, right? I find out that the cardiology group needs to recruit a cardiologist because someone's retiring in a few months, right? And there's, it's a lot of it is managing your patient roster and managing your referrals and stuff like that you don't always necessarily know who you're going to need and when. So I think that is something that needs to be specifically focused on once you move into a leadership role, because succession planning is ensuring you retain the people you have and develop them to the best of their abilities. But it's also identifying organizationally what services you might want to expand and what services you might want to include, and a lot of other aspects. One of the things we touched on maybe about 10 minutes ago was going from a peer to a leader and stuff like that. But how do you help physicians navigate those relationships with their former peers?
Gosh, that can be so tricky, especially for physicians that are now leading their peers. And if they're still practicing, so if they've retained some clinical time, they're still a peer and a leader or supervisor. And that's just a tricky place to be. So we talk a lot about the wearing of two hats. When are you wearing the hat as the individual contributor, as the peer? And when do you have to put on that organizational leader hat and put the priorities of the organization first? So we work together to develop strategies for maintaining their clinical credibility. And that's even more important if they stop practicing altogether. So how do you maintain clinical credibility and establish this leadership authority or at least influence? And so to do this, we talk about boundary setting, we create clarity around intentions, and really focus on values-based decision-making to aid in any decision process. And then learning to delegate in a way that leverages their clinical expertise rather than undermining it.
Excellent. So at this point, I'd kind of like to discuss a bit of a case study and stuff like that. So can you walk us through a specific case study that demonstrates these principles in action?
Yes, I'd love to. So this is a story about Dr. Jane Doe. I'm going to keep the name confidential.
Nice.
But she became a new department chief and medical director. And she went to an entirely new system in a new community. And then at this time as well, this was a big step up in her leadership journey. So she had a much more expanded scope, and for the first time had direct reports that she also had to manage. So her initial challenges were establishing her reputation and her leadership brand among this new team, and then fostering relationships throughout the organization that she had to build from scratch. She didn't work in the system prior to her leadership role, so these were all new relationships. The third was navigating this new system and their cultural norms, which were very different from the system she had left. Then she had to build an effective team. And as I mentioned, she was new to having direct reports, so that was a new space. And then the fifth is that work-life integration. She had family and young kids at home. And so a challenge was how to maintain her personal resilience while onboarding in a new system, which she knew would take some extra investment of energy and time in the first year.
So can you tell us a bit about how the coaching intervention worked in that scenario?
Yes, absolutely. We implemented a 12-month coaching program that was set up into biweekly sessions. And I always start with a validated behavioral assessment because that helps identify strengths that people can lean on. And then also it uncovers some opportunities where we can develop skills and grow skills. So we developed her personal leadership brand and mission as a first component because that was going to serve to guide her decisions and behaviors from there on forward. Simultaneously, we also began developing her individual development goals by working with her immediate supervisor and other peers that she would interact with. So it helped identify the system priorities, and then she could make SMART goals that aligned to those system priorities and that allowed us to track her progress. So the team space was interesting. She quickly found out there was a member on her team that wasn't performing to standard. So we worked on that really challenging skill often of providing corrective feedback, setting clear expectations, and offering support to this person. And as it turned out, her direct report chose to leave this role. But then that gave her the opportunity to backfill the role. So we spent some time developing clarity on what she wanted to see, what skills and behaviors and success metrics would come out of that role. And then at the same time, and this is the complexity, it's never one thing. Or not the same time, but partway through the year, there arose this really challenging medical staff advisory committee issue that she had to navigate. And it was a very high stakes, contentious situation. So we were able to role play, work through some core issues, work through various perspectives that were impacting the conflict that she was encountering. And in the end, the situation was resolved in a very favorable outcome overall. And then I mentioned that last piece of work-life balance. After about 6 months, things were running pretty smoothly for her. We talked about the studies showing you integrate faster when you have coaching. And she was ready to really start tackling that work-life integration. And so through working on her own efficiency, her ability to delegate effectively and confidently, she was able to reclaim some of her personal time, hired a personal trainer and shed a few unwanted pounds. But most importantly, she was showing up at family events with more energy and engagement. And so she was really able to balance out her professional life and her personal life in a meaningful way.
Excellent. What would you say were the keys to her success?
Well, it starts with her for sure. In any coaching engagement, it's really how much the client or the coachee invests in themselves. So she was committed to do the work. She kept her coaching sessions because she found it was that time to be intentional. It was carved out, and she could work through areas that were challenging for her in this dedicated space. So one of the things I like to really impress on people is coaching is not about giving people answers, but helping those leaders find the right answers themselves. And so her investment in herself was really the key. And then just the things we've talked about, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but that structured support, that safe space to learn, to try on new skills, to experiment with different perspectives was really helpful for her in building her confidence, because she could try some of these skills in a safe place where she wasn't being judged.
So as we start getting to near the end of our webinar, I'd like to do a bit of a Q&A section, and I've got some questions here that we can lead to. What has been your experience with different onboarding practices, and which ones are the most effective?
It's a good question. The most effective approaches to onboarding combined the structured organizational onboarding with personalized coaching support. So as we talked about earlier, having a defined job description. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to physician leaders that didn't have a job description or weren't provided with one. So that structured job description that clarifies the role, the authority, the accountability is really critical. And then having a formal introduction to the leadership team and the key stakeholders is important, even if the leaders from within the system, they're coming in a different role, and they need to be treated just as someone coming from without would be treated, with the same respect of introducing that person in this new role. So those are definitely some best practices from the formal onboarding side. And then pairing that with 4, 6, or 12 months of coaching to really help that person with their individual skills and confidence during the onboarding process is super helpful, because it's totally overwhelming. You feel like you're drinking from a fire hose a lot of times when you move into these new roles. So having that dedicated coaching space to help slow things down, parse out the issues is really impactful.
Well, and it's interesting because I like to sit and debrief after every search or after a certain period of time without having finalized a search. And there's what I've noticed is two trends. One is somebody sends you a job description and tells you the salary and how many vacation and says, okay, find me somebody, right? And the other one is the preference is, you talk about the culture, you talk about the team, you talk about the budget, you talk about the challenges, you talk about the opportunities and the expectations and stuff like that. And often those are like 1 hour, hour and a half meetings with whoever this person is going to report to. And those are always the successful ones, because you need to engage with somebody and you need to be able to give them enough information to engage with them in order to get them to participate in that process, right? And if you're just like, oh, here's a job description, let me know what you think. There's too much to read between the lines, right? So I definitely think that's a key thing to, a key thing to consider, right? Is truly defining and understanding what you're looking for, and then adapting it as you go through the process, right?
Absolutely.
So as a leadership coach, what barriers do you see in healthcare to implement leadership coaching?
Well, oftentimes people cite the cost or time as the two biggest barriers, but I think it's really about perspective. When you invest the time and money in coaching, and you look at the return that you get as far as a faster time to integration, faster time to reaching full productivity, almost 50% faster time to reach full productivity. And we talked about that 26% turnover rate in the first 2 years. When you look at the potential costs of not investing time and money in coaching, I think the reality is very clear. And so it's about perspective. And if we take into account all of those perspectives, then I think this barrier is really more of a myth than it is a barrier. But the second area that often comes up is coaching had been positioned too often as remedial or for people on a performance improvement plan. And coaching is not remedial, it's really developmental. The most successful organizations position it that way. It's as an investment in their leaders and in their leaders' success, because we're building on strengths. We're making powerful leaders even stronger, even better with the coaching. And as I said earlier, coaching is about helping someone navigate to their own answers, where a performance improvement plan, you're giving them the answers. You're not giving them the answers, but you're giving them the expectations. And coaching is really, the expectations come from within that person.
Well, it's interesting. Another thing that's looked at with the same lens is references, right? People have this notion that doing references is a determining factor of whether we hire you or not. And I always think that if you're making the decision based on references, you've already lost, because nobody gives references intentionally that are going to say this person's terrible. I always say leverage the references to understand the person you're getting and understand how to work with them better, how to onboard them better, how to integrate them better. And those types of things can be included as feedback into a coaching loop as well, right? So, I think we have to start looking at developing people as opposed to, these disciplinary or yay, nay type of scenarios. So someone sent me a question and they asked, how do you measure the success of leadership coaching interventions?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's important if we're going to talk about the ROI. We use both quantitative and qualitative measures. So quantitatively, we'd look at time to productivity, retention rates, 360-degree feedback scores, and specific performance metrics that we identified early on with their role mapping. But qualitatively, we might look at confidence levels, work-life integration, and stakeholder satisfaction. So, but the key to all of this is identifying up front what you want to measure to define success, and then getting those baseline measurements so that you can, in fact, track the progress over time.
Yeah, because I think setting expectations for what you're going to measure before you start measuring is a better way to set someone up for success than changing the goalposts on them. But I have another question. What's the typical duration of leadership coaching for a physician leader?
Yeah, 6 to 12 months would be the typical for any major role transition. Those first 90 days are really critical for establishing foundational skills and establishing that role clarity. As I mentioned, a lot of people feel like they're just drinking from the fire hose. So having a coach to walk with them through those first 90 days is critical. But then the next 4 to 6 months, we can spend focusing on skill application and refinement. And beyond that, a lot of physician leaders like that regular check-in. They like that sounding board and that safe psychological space to process. So while most engagements are 6 to 12 months, I know of a number of leaders that have kept a coach for 3, 5, 10 years. They may slow down on how often they have check-ins, but it's just nice to know that that hand is out there to grab and that you've got this safe thought partner.
It's interesting because I think that's managing that relationship and building a continual improvement on your relationship is a good thing. But so I have a bit of an interesting question here. How do you handle physician leaders that are resistant to coaching?
I think that goes back to perspective that we talked about earlier. So we want to start with role clarity. We want to start with the intention. What is the intention behind offering coaching? If our intention is to strengthen a good leader and help them be successful in their role, that would be analogous to a sports professional having a coach to help them continue to be better and to work out kinks in the game when they run into those. If it's positioned as a performance improvement plan, that's not coaching, that's remediation. And so I like to avoid that. And when we need to have that clarity up front with physicians when we broach the idea of coaching. So being, again, it just comes back to intentions and being clear on what the intentions are.
Nice. So the final question before we head into the last kind of section of our conversation today is, what advice would you give a healthcare organization that wants to start a leadership program and might not have anything in place right now?
Yeah, again, I always go back to start with clarity of what are your goals? What are what do you want to get out of this? Why are you starting it? And what do you hope to see? And when you begin with that, then we can start to build back into, well, what's missing today, what needs to be added. We'll go back to a lot of the role clarity, and then what skills are necessary for that the person in that role to be successful. Because the physicians that succeed in leadership roles aren't necessarily the ones that needed the least help. They're the ones who got the most effective support.
Right. Well, and it's much like sports, right? Is the winning team every year usually has the best team supporting the athletes, right? And ensuring that they have the tools to be successful. It's not about moving somebody from the second to the third line in hockey or whatever. It's really just about how does each person perform that at their best. So we're coming up close to the end of our webinar. I'd like to kind of tweak up some takeaways for the audience so that they can kind of take a highlight, because we've been talking for a while and they might not remember everything we said. So let's tee up some takeaways.
All right. Well, I have three. The first is that physician leadership transitions require structured support beyond traditional onboarding. And these challenges that leaders face are predictable, and they can be systematically addressed with the right approach. And the second is that leadership coaching provides personalized, contextualized development during critical transition periods. It's not about fixing problems, it's about accelerating success. And the third takeaway is organizations see measurable returns through faster integration, reduced turnover, and improved performance. So the ROI is clear when you consider the alternative costs of a failed transition.
Yeah, and from a recruitment standpoint, I think it does multiple things. One is it creates, a sustainable leadership team in your organization. It develops the consistent leaders. It allows you to retain the best of who you have because you've supported them. But also, it's like anything else, is that people want to work where they're going to be supported the most. People want to work where the cool people are, and you will attract more candidates and potentially higher quality candidates because they know that they're going to go somewhere and be supported.
Yes, exactly. The investment in leadership development during onboarding and beyond pays dividends through the enhanced organizational performance and physician satisfaction. And that trickles down into the people they lead, their staff and colleagues. So it's really about setting leaders up for success rather than hoping they figure it out on their own.
Well, and it's interesting because one of the things that I noticed in talking to someone on the podcast is, and I don't remember the statistics to go along with, so I apologize in advance, but once they improved their clinical leadership, they saw an improvement in their employee survey scores, right? So they saw an improved engagement with their clinical staff, but they also saw an increase. It was in the U.S. They saw an increase in patient satisfaction.
Yes.
Right. So the investment at the leadership level was permeating into all of the different levels and everybody that was interacting at that space. So I think we're not just investing in the clinical people. I think we're investing in providing the best possible care to patients as well, because the happier and the better supported the clinician is, the better care they're going to provide, right?
You're exactly right, Kevin. And neurocognitive research shows this. We have mirroring neurons, and we tend to mirror the energy and the disposition of people around us. That's why when you have one member of a team that's experiencing burnout, it can quickly permeate through the rest of the team. And so when we can reverse that and we create leaders who are thriving, who bring in positive energy and optimism into their workspace, that also is going to permeate throughout the teams that they lead.
Yeah, and it's interesting because healthcare is a very big big social enterprise of relationships, communication, and people. And it's one thing to train people on how to use a Da Vinci robot. It's another thing to teach people the behaviors to be successful in interacting with others, and and avoiding this notion of I'm the expert, do as you're told type of thing. Because we're in a world now where everybody's got access to so much more information. The ability to lead in this environment is much more driven by emotional intelligence than ever before, in my mind.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more that, acquiring skills it's important, but it's also table stakes. The people that are going to emerge as top performers are those with high emotional intelligence who understand how to create connections and relationships and trust.
Yeah. Well, and that's in my business in recruiting, AI is prevalent, right? And everybody you talk to is telling you a different way they're utilizing AI and stuff like that. But the reality is, and my philosophy and my thoughts on this over the next 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, et cetera, is that AI is a tool that's going to elevate the communication and interaction amongst people, right? Because it'll be a tool to allow me to broaden my network of people and allow me to have more conversations. So my view is I want AI to stop my emailing, or stop me from doing emails, stop me from putting people in databases, and have me be on the phone more, right? Because those are the interactions that have a greater value. And I think that's what we're hoping as well. And, prime example, not to go sidetrack, but, my family doc uses an AI scribe. So now when I meet with him, he's talking to me one-on-one, and the AI is worrying about notes. So his ability to do that interpersonal piece is increased, right? So that's my little sidetrack about AI. So Dr. Woods, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. You've been a guest on my podcast, and we've talked countless times. I truly appreciate the unique lens that you view things through, both as a coach, but also as a former physician and physician leader. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk today.
Well, thank you for having me, Kevin. It's always a fun conversation with you. And I appreciate all the work you're doing to make sure great leaders get into positions where they can be effective. And so I hope our conversation today gives organizations some practical strategies for supporting their physician leaders during this time where we're seeing a lot of critical transitions.
Excellent. So, and last thing to our audience and anybody in the healthcare, the landscape's getting more difficult, more challenging. We're going to see a lot of additional challenges with respect to workforce in healthcare, and I think we need to intentionally develop physician leaders to allow us to get the most out of all the different vision and disciplines and perspectives in healthcare. And thank you for joining us today. This will be available. It is being live, but it'll also be available on YouTube. It'll sit on LinkedIn as well. And you can find Dr. Kristen Woods on LinkedIn. If you're looking for advice or coaching and want to talk to the best, then I would say find her and connect. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.